All right. It looks like I'm live. So I haven't done a a live stream in quite a while, and I was recently asked on YouTube by the Orville Nation. I was asked, "Well, hey, what's your goal with YouTube anyway? Why are you doing YouTube?" And it got me thinking, and it made me realize that if I want to continue doing YouTube and if I want to make any kind of impact, I have to answer that question. So I thought I would actually answer that question uh, on a live broadcast. So what I've been thinking is I've been doing a podcast for several weeks now with Dave Beatty. And Dave Beatty is a friend of mine. He is a professional comic book artist who's worked for both DC and Marvel and various independent projects. And and he's been doing a show, a podcast for quite a while. It's a what I call a true podcast. It's audio only. And what I've been thinking is I would like to have some sort of a video supplement to the show where I can talk about things maybe in a little bit more of a concise manner than we do in the podcast, because in the podcast we talk about subjects at length. But also, what we've been doing is we've had a news segment in our podcasts where we talk about things that have been going on the last week, things that we picked up. And it's stuff that I've heard. And then I kind of try to get Dave's reaction. And sometimes the stuff Dave has heard and he tries to get my reaction. And what's kind of neat is because we don't script it, you get to get our sort of natural reaction to whatever it is that the other person's saying. And that actually goes for the whole show because the show's not scripted. But what's nice about the news segment is sometimes Dave will tell me things that I'm completely unaware of, and vice versa. And that actually happened on the last show. So I wanted to kind of do. I want to keep my videos kind of short. Um, that's the kind of stuff that I tend to like. Is I kind of tend to like shorter videos that are in the say 10-minute to 20-minute time range, and that's what I'm going to be shooting for. I think that will also help me as a podcaster in terms of trying to keep my speech, concise and tight, and kind of get my thoughts more organized so that I'm doing these things sort of quickly off the top of my head because that's what I have to do for an unscripted podcast. So I thought I would start from the beginning and let everybody know that the last episode has dropped. Typically, what happens is Dave and I will record on Wednesday each week, and then we go through a process of, I should say, Dave actually does. Dave is essentially the producer of the show as well to being the host. I consider myself the co-host. I consider Dave the host. It's his show, but I'm now his co-host. And he's basically the producer in terms of he's the one who basically takes our recordings. We do separate recordings that he takes and then he edits them together. He adds he adds sound effects and things like that. And for anybody on YouTube that hasn't heard of our podcast, it's called the Rogues Radio Podcast. It's pretty much available anywhere on any platform because it's available on TuneIn. I've actually listened to it on my Alexa. I've listened to it on my phone. I need to listen to it actually on my computer. So I like to do my YouTube broadcast from my computer. And one thing, if you're doing Alexa, it seems Alexa sometimes gets confused. It seems the best way to get Alexa to play the podcast is say the Rogues Radio Podcast. If you just say Rogues Radio Podcast, it seems to get confused because apparently there was another Rogues Radio Podcast years ago that's not active. And I guess that's what kind of confuses it. I have to talk to Dave and we have to try to maybe figure out if there's an easier way for that because I see Alexa and things like Google Home and those other kind of voice platforms being a great way for podcasts to expand, become more popular, and just kind of the future of podcasting, really, when you think about it. So I see a great potential there, and I'm happy to be doing that podcast. I'm very happy to be doing it. So in our last episode, we actually got into the Dark Crystal. Now, this is a little bit of a little bit misleading because what I'm holding in my hand is a copy of the Dark Crystal movie. This is a DVD of the Dark Crystal movie, and what we didn't talk about the Dark Crystal movie in the podcast. Instead, we talked about the prequel, the Netflix original series, Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance. And it was our reaction. It was kind of neat to do this because Dave and I do a lot of older stuff, a lot of retro stuff. I prefer the term, by the way, of vintage or classic. I think retro is a kind of a different thing. I should get into that one of these days, talk about what I think retro actually is and how it's kind of misappropriated. But Dave and I do a lot of, because Dave and I are in a lot of ways really old school in terms of, we kind of grew up in the 80s, both of us, and we kind of that late 70s, which is like Star Wars era, and after, through the 80s, maybe to the early 90s, that was sort of like our prime time when we were growing up and things really made a big impression on us. Very typical of a lot of people. That's when you really kind of establish your fandom, I think, for a lot of us. It's certainly the case with me. And so we talk about a lot of things that are from yesteryear. But of course, what's interesting is because there are so many remakes happening, reboots, whatever you want to call them, most of the stuff is just straight up remakes. Because so much of that stuff is going on, we're able to now tie in a lot of the stuff we're talking about with whatever new is coming out. Like we did a episode not too long ago where we talked about Revenge of the Sith. And the big reason we did that was because of the news about the Obi-Wan series being greenlit for Disney Plus. So in our last episode, which I said, like I said, typically we record on Wednesday. The episode is usually up by Friday. I usually don't post until Monday because my weekends are pretty busy, and I have a lot of family obligations on the weekends. So usually what happens with me is I usually don't make a post on my Twitter account until the following Monday. And that was the case with this last podcast as well. I only made a post on my Twitter account a few hours ago regarding the new episode. So what I'm thinking is I'm going to start trying to do little videos, probably on Mondays, maybe Tuesdays, maybe the day before we actually record our new episode. And that way I can kind of talk about things that have happened over the weekend that maybe are not included in the podcast. And that way I can also kind of supplement it better that way. But the first thing I just wanted to kind of just do like an advertisement, say, please check it out. The latest episode of Rogues Radio podcast. We did talk about the Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance, and I don't want to give out too much information about my opinions on it or Dave's opinions on it. I want you to listen to the podcast. But what we've also been doing is we've been doing a news segment. We've been doing a news roundup segment pretty consistently on the show. And in the last news segment, Dave actually surprised me with some stuff, and I kind of surprised him with some stuff. I thought I could talk a little bit more about that. So one of the things that I talked to Dave about was that there was a prediction made by another YouTuber regarding Star Trek Picard, and it was a really sort of inflammatory prediction. And the prediction was that Star Trek Picard was actually going to go in a really crazy direction at the end of the first season. And the prediction was that Star Trek Picard was going to end its first season with the death of Picard, and then his distraught crew in tribute to him would go ahead and name the ship Picard. And I wanted to get Dave's reaction on it. So please listen to the podcast if you want to get Dave's reaction, because he hadn't heard this prediction. And I do want to make it clear that this was a prediction. This wasn't a rumor or anything like that. And I thought that was kind of crazy. In one sense, I can see CBS All Access doing that. Unfortunately, I can totally see them doing that. And I do want to give credit to Doomcock, because Doomcock was the person who made the prediction. And I take it with a grain of salt. Anybody who's seen Doomcock knows what he's about, knows how he says things. And, honestly, he's very negative and very critical of CBS All Access. I am cautiously optimistic about Star Trek Picard, but unfortunately, I could see CBS All Access doing something crazy like that. I really could. As I recall, the way that Doomcock put it, he was he was basically saying the big reason for this is because of Patrick Stewart's price tag. Uh, that it would just be easier to kind of get rid of him. The biggest problem with that, of course, is that the name of the show is Star Trek Picard, and also I know that Patrick Stewart is very proud of being a co-producer on that show. I've seen him on interviews and things like that. He takes the role very serious, and I think he's really into it. So it'd be hard for me to see him walking away from his own show like that. But it was a prediction that was put out there, and it's a rather shocking one. So we did talk about that in the podcast. If you want to get Dave's reaction to that, it's on the podcast. And then he kind of did a surprise on me, where he told me about the news that NBC Universal's streaming platform is planning another Battlestar Galactica remake. And it does sound like it's a remake. It's another remake. It's not a quote unquote reboot. A reboot, in my mind, is something that uses the established canon of a previous incarnation. Like, it uses that canon. And really, to me, a reboot is really about the time span between the two versions. If it's not continuous, like continuous seasons where it's 1 year after the other, or like a continuous movies where they come out every couple years or something like that, and it's all kind of planned out, then I see it more as a reboot. That's the way I see it. Or when it's really, really close. When it's really, really close and they just totally revamp the series with like a new star, I can kind of see that as a reboot too. Reboot is kind of a loaded term for me. It's kind of a marketing term that doesn't really mean anything. So, but there is this announcement that they're going to be doing a new Battlestar Galactica series. And I didn't know anything about this. And Dave sort of caught me off guard with this. And I've been able to think about it more and research a little bit more since the show. And I actually was able to find the showrunner, the person who's supposed to be creating this. He did another show called Mr. Robot, I believe, which I never watched. I'm not familiar with that show. So I don't know anything about that particular series, but he did a post on Twitter where he basically said this is not going to be a continuation of Ron Moore's version of Battlestar Galactica. And my understanding was it had already been stated that it wasn't going to be based on the classic original Battlestar Galactica. So it is going to indeed be a remake. It's going to be a new version of Battlestar Galactica. Take that for what it is. I personally thought that if he was doing some sort of revamping of the Ron Moore version, I was like, I don't get the point of that, especially with Ron Moore still being alive and not involved. That doesn't make any sense to me. I kind of would have liked him to do a revamp, or a continuation of the original one. I to do something to revive the original series, in my opinion. I would like to see that because I don't think the original series got as much play as it should have. I'm a big fan of the classic Battlestar Galactica, huge fan of the classic Battlestar Galactica. Not so much 1980, by the way. I didn't get into 1980, although I've seen most of the episodes, what few there are. But I would love to have seen something done with the classic Battlestar Galactica. So we'll see what they do. I think it's interesting that basically NBC Universal is it seems to me, kind of using Battlestar Galactica the same way that CBS All Access is using Star Trek and Star Trek Discovery as sort of its flagship show. At least in my mind, that's kind of the way it seems to be coming out. And I did mention on the podcast, and I'll mention it here because I like to mention anytime I can, I am kind of sick of paywalls, and I think this is not going to end well. It's going to end one of two ways. It's either going to be a bubble that bursts, and most of these streaming channels, streaming sites, whatever you want to call them, are going to go the way of the dodo and die inglorious death, or somebody's going to come along and actually decide to be a platform and take a bunch of these streaming services together and package them for you, and it'll just be cable all over again. And some combination of the two might happen as well. There are so many streaming channels happening. You can see it kind of being halfway, where maybe half of them all die, and then the stronger ones survive, and then they got all repackaged in some sort of a platform. We'll see what happens. I personally kind of am already sick of it because it feels like I'm going to be dishing out money for all these different streaming services just to watch one show, one show. Um, so that's how I feel about that. The streaming wars, I'm calling it. I kind of want to get a hashtag going. I should have put that on this. Maybe I'll put that in the description of this later. So the other thing I want to talk about in the little time that I have left, because I am trying to keep these videos short, is Aron Eisenberg passed in the time between us recording the podcast and today. He passed this weekend. And I kind of wanted to relate a story about Aron Eisenberg because I recently met him at Star Trek Vegas, which was just in August. And it's really crazy to think about that it was just last month that I was interacting with him. And now he's passed away. And it's a sad thing. It's a very, very sad thing. And but I wanted to relate a positive story and kind of mention this about in tribute to him. So I met him at Star Trek Vegas. I went over to his table because I decided after his presentation, I went to his panel where he was actually dressed in makeup as Nog. And he was actually with the actor who played Rom, his father, on Deep Space Nine. He was in makeup. And Chase Masterson, who played Leto, was also on stage. And I believe, the Bajoran makeup, although it's hard to tell. I was in the back. But they did a great presentation. It was funny. It was cool. It was neat. They relayed a bunch of cool stories. Did a really great job. And then sometime after that panel, I was waiting for him at his table because I think they had mentioned in the panel after that one that they were a lot of the actors were going to be selling copies of the Deep Space Nine documentary at their tables. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to go over to Aron's table and I'm going to buy the documentary from him. And I did. And one of the things I wanted to relate is Aron Eisenberg had this really nice printed, I don't know what you call them, but like a little table marker that he had where it had all of the things that he was selling at his table and the prices and all that kind of stuff. And that's typical. A lot of the actors do this, but a lot of times all they do, they just handwrite it. You know what I mean? It'll say like, selfies, $30, autographs, $50, whatever it says, right? And one of the things that's interesting is that, nowadays it seems like everybody, all these actors, they all charge for selfies. And Aron's table marker said selfies free. And I really appreciated that. I really think that's awesome that he was doing that because quite frankly, I couldn't find another actor that was. And it kind of makes the experience not so good because, unless you're independently wealthy or you're just going to spend all your grocery money, it's impossible to get autographs from everybody in that room, in the dealer room. It's just extremely expensive if you did something like that. But at the same time, I want to go up and say hi to these guys. I want to meet them. I want to have some sort of interaction with them. And you kind of wonder how are you going to be received if I go up to this person when they're selling stuff, I don't buy anything, and I just go up and say, I want to shake your hand, I want to say hi, that kind of a thing. It makes it a little bit intimidating. And by having that big, it was very nicely printed, said right on there, selfies free. That instantly makes it so much easier to walk up to him and say, hey, hello, blah, blah, blah. Can I get a picture with you? That kind of thing. And then let the conversation roll as it will. And I really appreciated that. The other thing about Aron Eisenberg is that he was really good about if I sent him or like if I tagged him on a tweet and said something about him or something about Nog or something like that, he would respond. He would like it. And very often he would respond back and say, thank you, or, that's cool, or something. He would say something. And he did that to everybody, it seemed like. I know on the hashtag All Star Trek, which is a group that I participate in on Twitter, where we talk about episodes of Star Trek that are on Heroes and Icon, the network Heroes and Icons. Sometimes people would tag him and be talking about an episode, and he would respond back, and he would say something. So I just wanted to relate those personal stories about how good he was to the fans, my personal experience with him, and being very, very gracious with me. He took a picture with me, and I was very appreciative of how friendly he was. And I think it's a real shame that he passed far too young. He was only 50 years old. And I just wanted to say something about that. And I'll probably say more on the podcast coming up next week. So I think that's it for now. I'm just going over the 20-minute mark, and I will leave it at that. And in the meantime, live long and prosper.